Welcome to the Peace and Power Ukraine podcast, a place to discuss all aspects of public policy related to Ukraine. In so many ways, we know that Ukraine sits at the crossroads of modern history where East meets West and freedom meets totalitarianism. So thank you for joining during these turbulent and historic times. That's truly what we are in, historic times for Ukraine, Europe, and the entire world. I'm your host, Gary Marx. I'm looking forward to continuing, as always, to bring more light than heat as we dig in each discussion and have a great conversation. Today, we're going to have a conversation with my friend Dan Darling. And Dan, excuse me, I do want to make sure we read your bio so our listeners can know a little bit more about you. Dan is the director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. His forthcoming book is Agents of Grace. He's also a best-selling author of several other books, including The Original Jesus, The Dignity Revolution, The Characters of Christmas, The Characters of Easter, and A Way with Words. Also the host of a popular weekly podcast, The Way Home. And he studied at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and is a graduate of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He and his wife, Angela, have 4 kids. Dan, it's great to have you on.
Gary, it's great to be on here, my friend, and glad to talk about
Well,
all things
welcome.
Ukraine.
I want to make sure that we hear about your work at the Land Center as well, but I'd be remiss if we just buried the lead here. I really think we should start off with the Oval Office and what we saw happen between President Trump and President Zelensky last week. It was historic. Some people, look at this as a pivot point in all of our foreign policy history. But what's your take? Was it as dramatic as people say, or is there less than meets the eye?
Well, it definitely was a flashpoint and kind of unusual to see that kind of conflict between world leaders, at least in public. If you read anything about foreign policy or American history, those kinds of things happen behind the scenes all the time. I don't think it was good in any sense. Wherever you fall on the spectrum, when it comes to American policy toward Ukraine or how you feel about the president or don't feel, I don't think it was a great moment. But this situation with Ukraine is very fluid. And so I do, even though I'm very strongly pro-Ukraine, and I think, really think that they should be, continue to be a sovereign nation, that they're, a democracy that is, unjustly invaded by Vladimir Putin. I don't subscribe to the sort of hair on fire reaction to that I think is typical whenever Trump's president, that whenever there's an event, it seems like the reaction of a lot of folks is just hysteria and it's the worst possible thing. And I remember saying at the time that, it's still in Trump's interest to support Ukraine and to get a peace deal. I support Ukraine pretty strongly. I think Zelensky, who, is by every measure a courageous president and has been through a lot with his people, I think he made a mistake. I think he went in there and, you had President Trump speaking for 30 or 40 minutes pro-Ukraine, how much he loves Ukraine. He wants to invest in Ukraine. He may even put troops there. He's like, we're going to take, listen, if you're Zelensky and he's saying that, your job is to sit there and smile and get to an agreement to where both people are signing in and go home with an agreement. And I think he took the bait. He was trying to defend his country. I think he didn't read the room. But it does seem the peace negotiations are back on track, and we're headed. Hopefully, we could see what happens over the next few weeks.
Yeah, for the sake of peace and the Ukrainian people, you'd like to think that this is just a speed bump on the way to an ultimate peace. But President Zelensky, he's had 3 chances to sign this minerals deal, and he's balked now 3 times. He sent the letter to President Trump and said he's going to do it. By the time folks are listening to this podcast, he may have already signed that deal. Let's hope that that is the case, because it's my perspective that deal, that economic partnership, that investment is in fact a security guarantee. having Americans, president, business people fully invested in a relationship like that it's a deep and it's a sticky relationship that would force us into protecting that. Do you agree, Dan Darling?
I absolutely agree. And this is where I think a lot of our friends who are like us, very pro-Ukraine, kind of knee-jerk reaction, even to the minerals deal, was like, oh, it's America extorting money from Ukraine. No, what this is a baseline for a long-term partnership. And the thing you have to understand about this, it really has multiple benefits. One, as Trump said in that Oval Office moment, this implies U.S. investment, American contractors, American businesses there, which is a de facto security guarantee, because if our people are there, we're going to protect them. Also, if our people are there, Vladimir Putin, who's an evil man, but also a smart man, is not going to, I don't think, attack them and go after them. It also means if we are taking, and if we have a minerals agreement from Ukraine, with Ukraine, that means we're not in business with other nations who have minerals, right? It means that we're doing less with China and less with Russia, who also have rare earth minerals. So it's a pivot away from them, which weakens them. And I think it's a basis for more. One of the fundamental disagreements, I think, between Zelensky and Trump is really just about how this deal was orchestrated. I think for Donald Trump, he's thinking, let's let the minerals deal and a ceasefire be the basis for further negotiations for peace. I think for Zelensky, he was thinking, I want to get those things before I do these things. And I think that's where the disconnect was. And I can see both sides of that. But if you're in his position and you're being offered this, I think you just have to take it,
Yeah. Yeah. Great points. I think that's probably is the error that's happened with Zelensky looking at what he needs first. I think there's a lot of ways to guess about the future, and I'm going to ask you the harder question of you guess about the future. Is it even possible for when we get to the more difficult peace negotiations phase, is it possible to even have Trump and Zelensky working together? Or does Ukraine really need to look for somebody else to be lead just because there's so much baggage with Trump and Zelensky in their past?
That is an open question. Obviously, that's up to the Ukrainian people. And I was there last year. And it's interesting, even in Ukraine, the people are very supportive of Zelensky. He's been a heroic leader for 3 years. But I do think there's a weariness on his part. I've heard from people that he's worn out. Wartime leadership is exhausting. And I think from some folks we talked about who are agree with him on the security piece are probably thinking, okay, there's going to be someone come after him. So that's a really good question, and I think it depends how this peace process plays out. And I think what's happening, and I'm curious your perspective, Gary. What I think Trump is doing is he's first, working on Ukraine and Zelensky, and trying to solidify what he thinks Ukraine needs to do and can get them to agree to. Because that's actually the easier negotiation.
Right.
Then I think he's taking this to Putin and he's going to say, listen, I did all this with Zelensky and with Ukraine. You heard me. Now it's your turn to come to the table. And that's where I think you'll see him be really harsh and hard on Putin. I think there's a very real chance that Putin rejects the peace process or wants to keep fighting, and Trump could ratchet up his sanctions on him, start sanctioning oil and all this stuff. So it's a very fluid process.
Yeah, I think those are good points, Dan, and I'll answer it this way. You mentioned your bookshelf. On my bookshelf is The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump. And if you understand and go back and read that, you'll see he's in a negotiation here. And he is working on one side, and he's using maximum pressure on that side, whether we like it or not. For Ukraine, he's using maximum pressure with intelligence, with weapons being paused and frozen to bring Zelensky to the point of signing the minerals deal and coming to the table with a ceasefire. Maximum pressure. Then I think when that's done, then maximum pressure flips over onto the other side of that negotiating table. So there is there's a lot to watch unfold here. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, seeing the sausage being made in real time. And so every day there's a new development. Trump, whether you like Trump or don't like Trump, his style as president is to do everything out in the open, where probably previous presidents and probably future presidents a lot of these things will be, behind closed doors and selectively leaked out. With Trump, everything you see is what you get. And there's some benefits to that and there's some downsides to that. My only concern with these negotiations is that as we're pushing different people to come to the table, that we don't fully alienate our European counterparts.
Right.
I don't think that's fully happening. I think what Trump is doing is waking them up to invest in their own security. And I think the threat of the U.S. not being as involved, which I don't think will actually happen, I think it's more of a threat, is getting them to contribute more to their own security, which when I was in Ukraine, that's one of the things Ukrainians said. They wish that Western Europe would contribute more, stop buying gas from Russia, and all these things. There's $300 billion in seized Russian assets in Belgium that they could totally unfreeze and give to Ukraine. So my only concern is that we don't fray those European alliances. But, the European alliance has had tension points before in our history, and it's always recovered. So I'm not as worried about it. I do think the British Prime Minister is playing a really key role here. And if you watch the way him and Macron approached Trump when they came, it was really textbook. They know how Trump operates. They know how to do that. Zelensky probably should have modeled his negotiation off of that. I think he was more calibrated to negotiating with Biden. And he didn't really pivot the way, here's a new person here. I got to do this like you do when you're negotiating. But all that to be said, as Christians, we're praying for peace in Ukraine. We're praying for Russia to stop, their invasion and all these things.
Yeah, the European perspective is one that I think most Americans would view a necessary wake-up call, a necessary move from a slumber of just relying on minimal investment in NATO and letting us do all the heavy lifting, that moment was really necessary. They've got to deliver more. In essence, the critics will say, we did all the heavy lifting on the security front. In essence, that then allowed them to fund their modern welfare states. So the American taxpayer was doing that. That would be one perspective. So they've had to wake up through this and realize that this has to be major security investments made by them apart from NATO. NATO will still be there and has been, you could argue the most successful treaty organization in the history of the world, maybe separate from the Hellenic League or something going way back when. My sense is that there is a pivoting away from Europe. There is a spiritual element here that I think we'd want someone with your perspective to comment on. We've been in kind of this realpolitik mode and talk about negotiations, this, that, and the other. But for Putin, this is a holy war. Help our listeners understand what that means. And when it's his turn to negotiate, how difficult is it for him just to push aside his calls of a holy war and bringing back the Russian Empire, Ruski Mir?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. If you actually listen to Vladimir Putin, he did not invade Ukraine because of NATO, contrary to what some of the Ukraine skeptics might say. But he thinks Ukraine should be part of Mother Russia. And he goes back. You have to go back with Putin. He doesn't want to revive the Soviet Union. He wants to revive the old Russian Empire. He wants to. He goes back to the czars. And I think for him, it's a holy war. And really, this is something that a lot of people who don't have a lot of experience with Ukraine, including a lot of Christians I talk to, don't understand. But Ukraine is sort of the Bible Belt of that part of Europe. They have a higher concentration of evangelicals than any of their surrounding nations. They are a hub of missionary and church planting activity. At least they were before the war. And Christianity is growing within Ukraine still. In fact, when we were in Ukraine, we talked to some people in Poland, and they said all the Ukrainians that came over to Poland were starting to plant churches and all those kinds of things. When Russia takes over a territory, they get rid of religious freedom. You know, you if you're a Baptist pastor, or Pentecostal pastor, or evangelical pastor, you have to practice Russian Orthodox worship, which is really subservient to the state. It's an arm of the state. So the Christians that I've talked to that were in Ukraine, Baptists and evangelicals and others, they see it as a spiritual battle, that the enemy's trying to shut down the work that God has been doing there. And it's hard to disagree with them. I mean, we have one of our alum who got his PhD here. He's a president of the Ukrainian Baptist Theological Seminary in Lviv. They have 2,000 students, Gary, that are training pastors for ministry, and they're sending people all over. In fact, I talked to pastors over there who said this is a time of great revival, a time of spiritual awakening in Ukraine. They're worried actually that when the war is, they want the war to be over, but they're worried that when the war is over, that people will not, they want that to continue when the war is over. So one of the things that really impressed me about my time in Ukraine, more than anything, more than the spirit of the Ukrainian people and the beauty of the country and their culture, was the strength of the Ukrainian church under fire. I mean, they have held that country together. And I think this is one of the reasons they've been so courageous in fighting back against Russia, because the church has sort of held that nation together.
Yeah, that's a powerful point, that when it comes to the fight that is in the people, it's built on a foundation of faith. And I remember in my time being in Ukraine, someone said, the believers in Ukraine, they're just not Christmas and Easter believers. They are serious, faithful people. And even those that might just be traditionalist Orthodox, they're not just also Christian and Easter believers. They're going to church 10, 13, 14, 15 times a year, a lot more than, if you just think of your average identifying Christian here in America that might go twice a year and celebrate Lent, right now, but not a lot of other stickiness to their faith commitment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think this is something that I don't think, if you're not familiar with Ukraine, you might realize. You might think, oh, it's just a country over there, I don't know much about it. Now, I tell you, the people that really do understand this, and you may have found this experience too, is when I go to teach and preach in Baptist churches and evangelical churches around the country in the United States, there is a kinship with the people of Ukraine. A lot of churches have sent mission trips over there. They've worked as part-time missionaries over there. And so I think evangelical Christians particularly understand the stakes of what's going on there. But I think there's a sense that they would like to see the war end in a just peace, both supporters of Ukraine here and the Ukrainian people there. This is one reason, back to the realpolitik part of this, that this is one of the failures, I think, of the Biden administration, is besides the fact that it was his policies that kind of got us to this point, if you think about it, before Russia invaded his, he let them do the Nord Stream pipeline. He was really coddling Putin and not talk about the seriousness of their wanting to invade Ukraine, but also the way he talked about the war. I think he could have mentioned or could have emphasized that aspect of it. And there's a religious persecution angle and a religious freedom angle here that, if you're on the left, you're hesitant to kind of raise those issues. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
in terms that Americans can understand,
And back to the bigger picture, don't you think from Trump's perspective here, he's trying to bring a peaceful solution to this conflict and, maybe change the dynamics of our commitments in Europe, because ultimately he wants to pivot east to the Far East. He wants to pivot towards China in dealing with that threat, which is not just a military and nuclear threat, but an economic threat. And, this goes back to his perspective all the way back in the 80s. He's been talking about the China threat for much longer. So when we're just on this time talking about Ukraine, the ripple effect is much bigger. The implications of what happens in Ukraine is all precedent for what might happen in a conflict with China and Taiwan and in the Far East?
Yeah, I think if you zoom out, I think he's got a couple of objectives. One is he does want peace, and it's hard to argue. He said he wants the killing to stop. Now, it can't be peace at any cost, and I think he knows that, but he does want peace. But if you can get Europe to wake up and harden their own defense, we're not abandoning Europe. We're not abandoning NATO. Everyone with their hair on fire about that. That's not happening. But if they can contribute more to their defense and we don't have to contribute as much, we can build up then our own defense and we can concentrate more on China. And I think one of the goals that Trump has, I don't know if he can do this because other presidents have tried, is to try to drive a wedge between Russia and China, right? If we can get peace here and decouple Russia from China, China's suddenly weakened. And I think we do have to think about China as a threat. We're sort of heading into a new Cold War in many ways, where we were. I'm a child of the Cold War, which is why I'm still reflexively on the side of whoever Russia's against, right? But I think we're entering a new Cold War, and I think we have to be serious about that. And one of the ways we do that is trying to strengthen our defense and all those kinds of things.
Sure. Tell me a little bit more about your work there at the Richard Land Center and what you're doing with cultural engagement, because some people would think, oh, they're just going to talk about those soft issues. But when you're engaging the culture, it's foreign policy. It's the whole wide range of issues. Is that right?
Yeah, it really is. And, Richard Land, for those of you who don't know who he is, he was and still was a leading, I would say, evangelical statesman. He was president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is a Southern Baptist agency, for about 25 years, and was always fluent on foreign policy, on domestic policy. He was a key advisor to George W. Bush. It kind of mirrors his emphases on all these things. He was a commissioner for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I think Christians should think well about all these things. And our goal really is to try to raise up a generation here of students that can enter public life in some capacity, whether it's pastors or working in public service or business, that have a well-rounded Christian worldview that can take their faith and apply it to the world around them, to steward their citizenship well, and to equip pastors and church leaders for how to think Christianly about a changing world and changing culture. Christians, I believe that Christians can't retreat into ourselves. That God, as Jesus says in John 17, He hasn't taken us out of the world, but He's put us in the world. That we have a responsibility to love our neighbors, and part of loving our neighbors is helping to see good policies passed that affect the flourishing of our neighbors. We're stewards of this representative republic, this democracy we have. We have a voice and a vote, and it's our responsibility, as much as we can with what limits we have in terms of influence, to shape the kind of country we live in. And, we're trying to equip people, and people have varied callings on how they do that. But I do think it's important for us to think well about those things.
Right. So Southern Baptists have a major influence here in the U.S. just by size, but a lot of leaders in Washington might mistake them, and particularly maybe on the left, as being, the Washington Post famously said, poor, uneducated, and easy to command. And I think one thing that Richard Land really did with his work was he changed people's understanding of Southern Baptists, because he was someone that was such an academic, studied at Oxford. He was erudite. He would debate people in the public square in a very powerful way. Would you agree that was something that he did to transform how people viewed us?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what was remarkable about him is that he could be on Meet the Press, and he could be in the Oval Office. And here's a guy who went to Princeton and Oxford. And yet he also would be preaching at a Baptist church every week somewhere. He'd go preach at a little country church, and he could relate to ordinary people that way. So he really was able to do both. But yeah, I think the image of evangelicals and even of Southern Baptists is sort of, simple-minded people that don't understand these things. That's not really true. I mean, we have Southern Baptists, really do education. We have 6 seminaries. We have multiple state colleges that are really, really good and are training and equipping people in a biblical worldview. But I do think Southern Baptists, if I can just brag on us for a bit, know how to translate both worlds. I think we have a lot of educated people who nevertheless know how to talk to ordinary folks. And so we talk in America a lot about the class divide between the elites, the establishment, and the working class. And I think, good ministry in this age is bridging these gaps, right? And reaching both people. And so we try to get involved in our country because we care about people. We care about sharing the gospel. We care about seeing people flourish. And, we're not a perfect group of people by any stretch. Every group has issues and problems, but as a Baptist, I would take us over anyone else. So,
well, let me give you a fastball here as we start to wind down. I know Richard Land had to have talked about the idea of peace through strength, and that principle is applied still today. You might have some on the MAGA side that say peace through strength means one thing, some on the traditional Reaganite side that say it means another thing. How do you answer that, Dan Darling? What does that mean in today's modern context, a policy of peace through strength?
Well, I think it originated with Reagan, and I think Trump is trying to do this. He's going to do it in his own way, and there may be ways he does it that you agree with and ways you disagree with. But it's this idea that, and you've traveled the world, and I have not as much as you have, but I've traveled a little bit. When you go around the world, people will tell you that if America retreats from the world, if America is not strong, someone else, some other entity will fill that void. China, Russia, and they won't be as virtuous as America. And America has not been perfect by any stretch in our foreign entanglements, but a strong America is strong for the world. And I think the idea of peace through strength is when the rogue nations and the dictators of this world know that America is strong and is willing to use its might, that actually is a great negotiating tool for peace. This is what Reagan did in the Cold War. Reagan built up our defenses, but never, he won the Cold War without firing a single shot. And I think peace through strength is to say we're strong. And I think Trump is trying to replicate some of that in his own unique Trumpian way. But I think it's a good policy. It doesn't mean you want to go to war all the time. In fact, I think you avoid war. There's a misconception that if you just retreat from the world, if you draw down your defense, even well-meaning Christians, look at things like turn the other cheek and all these kinds of things were directed toward individual Christians, not states.
Right.
And we just should do that, then the world will be better. That actually leads to more war. That leads to more devastation for vulnerable people. But if there's an entity that's strong and for the most part benevolent, I think it leads to more peace.
Yeah. Yeah. So strong, you never have to use it.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And that's going to lead towards peace. We're always digging deeper about peace and power here in this forum. Last question as we begin to wrap up this time is, if there's one thing that you really want our listeners to understand, if we walked away today and you'd be like, I should have mentioned this, that we really need to understand as we continue to think about these phases of historic times related to Ukraine, what might that be?
Well, I would just urge Christians listening to pray for Ukraine. And I want to emphasize strongly, Ukrainians are good people who love their country. They don't want to be Russian. They want to be Ukrainian. To pray for the church in Ukraine. The church is very strong there. We have evangelicals and Baptists sharing the gospel, making disciples there. And a free and sovereign Ukraine means that work can continue. So pray for Ukraine and pray for our leaders. Pray every day that President Trump and his national security team and the people who are in his ear and influence him, pray that they will be wise. That God will work in their hearts. The Bible says God works in the hearts of kings, like he moves, through a river, and pray for that. And that he'll get good advice, that Trump will get good advice and his team will get good advice, and that we can have peace. And I think the prayers, the Bible says the prayers of a righteous man availeth much. 1 Timothy 2 says we're to pray for all of our leaders. Pray for the European leaders and all these things, that they'll be wise and they'll govern well. And ultimately, we know we do the best we can. We speak out, we use our voice, we pray. We know that ultimately God is in charge. He's gathering history for himself. God is not in heaven wringing his hands about anything that's happened in the news today. That doesn't mean we should be passive or lazy, but it means at the end of the day, having done everything we can, we trust the Lord and his will and his sovereignty.
That's great. Thank you for giving us that perspective. While we struggle with foreign policy and peace negotiations and mineral rights deals, and we talk about all of that, we're not going to shy away from the fact that there is a spiritual component to all of these things happening under the sun. So thank you, Dan Darling, for being with us today on the Peace and Power Ukraine pod. And I hope you'll all come back next time as we continue to dig deeper and deliver more light than heat. Thanks all.